Welcome to our channel. 3 months ago, the renowned German theoretical physicist Sabine mentioned that the latest research has discovered that the brain indeed utilizes quantum effects. It turns out Penrose was right. He predicted 40 years ago that electrons in our brains are constantly communicating with the universe, constituting the true source of our consciousness. So, are our inspirations and dreams really originating from the depths of the universe? If so, could it go beyond just inspirations and dreams? Do other extrasensory perceptions and collective subconscious also stem from the depths of the universe? Today, let's delve into the story behind this. Let's go back to 1995. When former U.S. President Jimmy Carter visited Emory University. He was known for being a very down-to-earth president, going from a farm to the White House. Soon, the conversation turned to a topic that greatly interested the students: aliens and UFOs. Many U.S. presidents have been publicly asked this question. Clinton said, "I've asked the White House, but I must not be the first elected president to be brushed off by subordinates." Obama mentioned, "I asked, but I can't tell you." Biden stated, "I need to ask Obama about this question." Trump, in his exaggerated manner, bluntly stated, "We already have a super force, but let's hope we never have to use those terrible weapons." That's typical Trump, hardly a straightforward answer. However, President Carter was different. He shared a personal White House story with the students, involving the U.S.-Soviet Cold War, CIA secret experiments, and special operations in third countries, and more. It was beyond imagination. The students looked at each other in amazement, and President Carter's words were indeed later suppressed, leaving behind only urban legends. But is this really just an urban legend? In 2016, physicist Dr. Targ appeared at a book signing event with President Carter, and they exchanged smiles. More than 50 years had passed, and both were elderly individuals. Dr. Targ had not given up on investigating the story from that time, and President Carter had not irresponsibly hidden the truth. In fact, in this autobiography, the 92-year-old President Carter once again recounted that White House story. It turned out that it was not just a legend. In 1978, a Soviet Tu-22 bomber crashed accidentally in Central Africa when the place was known as the Republic of Zaire, which is now called the Congo. The next morning, the CIA reported this incident to President Carter. The CIA did not mention that it was a Tu-22, but simply informed the president that there were some important classified documents on a small aircraft. "We were using satellites and other high-altitude reconnaissance equipment to search for this aircraft, but without any success. We had to find it before the Soviets did," President Carter wrote in the book. With some hesitancy, a CIA agent in California recommended the services of a clairvoyant woman, who was then consulted. She wrote down a latitude and longitude which proved to be accurate, and several days later Elle was shown a photograph of the plane, totally destroyed and in a remote area. Without notifying Zaire's President Mobutu, we sent in a small team that recovered the documents and the bodies of the plane's occupants. It sounds exaggerated, doesn't it? The U.S. military's secret weapon turned out to be the magical crystal ball of a clairvoyant. However, that's how President Carter put it. As I understand it, the physicist named Targ was actually the secret commander in charge of the clairvoyant research back then. He presented several sketches and told the media that these were what the clairvoyant woman had drawn years ago. The resemblance to reality was striking. When asked further why he chose to come forward and tell these stories, it turns out that Targ had a personal and professional burden that he needed to resolve. 5 years ago, In 2019, at the age of 85, Targ, knowing his time was limited, decided to resolve his inner conflict. He found a journalist and took him to a cemetery in North Hollywood. Targ walked with his head bowed, counting the rows until he reached plot number 700. There lay Pat Price, unmarked. "This isn't the treatment you deserved. This might be the last time I get to see you," Targ said solemnly. Suddenly, there was a clap of thunder. Targ told the journalist that Pat, buried here, was an unsung hero. He once said, "The more you try to hide something, the more it shines like a lighthouse in your mental space. Nothing can truly be hidden. I'm nearing the end of my journey, but I will spend the rest of my days proving Pat's worth," Targ declared. Pat had passed away in 1975 without any ceremony or notice. When his family and Targ arrived, all they received was a box of ashes. At that time, Pat was only 57 years old. Despite suffering from heart disease, his sudden death in a hotel should not have led to such a hasty cremation. Especially considering he was directly employed by the CIA as an intelligence agent. Targ mentioned that he had recommended Pat to the CIA, and just 4 months after starting his job, he passed away. Before his death, Pat was an outstanding detective who had solved numerous challenging cases. One of the most famous was in 1974 when the granddaughter of the American publishing magnate Hearst, Patty Hearst, was kidnapped. An extremist group claimed responsibility for the abduction, displaying extreme arrogance and refusing to negotiate with the police. On the other hand, with the victim's identity being highly sensitive, the media was pressuring the police relentlessly, causing chaos within the police department. The best approach at that time was to locate the hiding place of the kidnappers and the granddaughter and then launch a decisive raid to rescue her. However, uncovering the hiding place was no easy task. It was at this critical juncture that Pat, who had already retired, returned to the police force. He requested an internal list of suspects from the police department and meticulously went through it page by page. Suddenly, he pointed to a person named Donald and declared, "This person is the mastermind." Additionally, he mentioned seeing 2 large white gas tanks across the highway, indicating that the granddaughter was held captive in a residence nearby. Immediately, a young police officer at the scene exclaimed, I know that place." In contrast, the others remained calm, some even showing a hint of disdain. They were familiar with this charlatan, Pat. Pat always acted this way, like a witch, right when everyone was most tense. Though his intuition had helped solve cases for the police before, it often proved unreliable. This time, the stakes were high, with countless media outlets watching closely. "Oh, so you're suggesting we go out there now and tell the media that our police wizard has found the hiding spot, and we're going on a magical raid together. Is that it? Is this reality?" Soon, a collective silence fell over the police team. The lead provided by Pat was selectively abandoned at that moment. However, as events unfolded, it turned out that Pat was right after all. The mastermind was indeed Donald, who was holding the granddaughter in a small cabin near the gas tanks. Dr. Targ was present at the scene as well. He was working for the Stanford Research Institute, a subsidiary of the CIA at the time. Alongside him was another physics PhD named Hal. They were conducting research on extrasensory perception. And Pat was one of the subjects of their study. He was someone with extrasensory abilities. Perhaps many have heard of the urban legend surrounding the Kozyrev mirror, a mirror that supposedly enables time travel. It is said that in Russia, there has been a long history of scientists researching topics on space-time, consciousness, and other fringe sciences. Among these, the Kozyrev mirror, born in the 1960s, stands out as a prominent example. Kozyrev, hailed as a forgotten genius, graduated from university at 20 and started working at the Pulkovo Observatory at 23. He was recognized as one of the most promising astrophysicists in Russia. However, at the age of 28, he was arrested and imprisoned. Cut off from the outside world in prison, unaware of the discovery of nuclear energy, he independently developed a theory about why the sun continues to burn, which is said to be the fundamental source of the urban legend that the sun's surface is 28 degrees. But it's possible Kozyrev is right. Kozyrev later also made predictions about transient lunar phenomena in the atmosphere of Venus, both of which were eventually confirmed. However, by the time he reached his 50s in the 1960s, the things he predicted were beyond the grasp of ordinary individuals. He delved into causal mechanics and theories of time, diverging significantly from Einstein's spacetime perspectives. Within his theoretical framework, Kozyrev developed the renowned concept of brainfields, and the technology of controlling brainfields to reverse spacetime known as the Kozyrev mirror technique. Russia has long been known for its black technology. According to investigations by the CIA, Russia's research origins are believed to date back to the Kaczynski incident in 1919. At that time, World War I had just ended, and people were eager to forget the past, to forget the pain. Even paying attention to the present seems somewhat outdated. In response to this sentiment, the field of science fiction began to flourish, and people started showing a keen interest in psychic phenomena. This interest was particularly pronounced in Europe and Russia, which had been deeply affected by the ravages of war. During this period, there was a popular belief in Europe known as mind broadcasting. The concept suggested that a person's thoughts could spread throughout the universe like a broadcast, and loved ones or individuals with extrasensory abilities could pick up on this mental broadcast and sense the information being transmitted at the other end. Moving on to the year 1919, there was a Russian clown who one day felt a sudden tightness in his chest. He heard the clear sound of a spoon falling, even though there was no spoon around him. Intuitively, he sensed that this meant his friend had met with a tragedy. As fate would have it, a few weeks later, news of his friend's death arrived, and it was confirmed that the time of death coincided exactly with the moment he heard the spoon fall. The clown was in deep despair, yet in reality, he had to rely on making people laugh to earn a living. He turned this tragic story into a farce, repeatedly amusing the nobles, scholars, and poets who had just emerged from the era of war with his performances. However, those who watched this drama found themselves laughing until tears started to flow. Who in a household had not experienced the loss of a loved one in the fires of war? Who in a household had not felt that sudden tightness in the heart upon receiving such tragic news during wartime? As a result, scientists began to earnestly study the mysteries among those who claimed such abilities, particularly the Russian scientist Kaczynski, who defined this type of psychic perception as extrasensory perception. On the other side of the ocean, Americans, untouched by the fires of war, upon seeing the direction of German research, chuckled. "How come you're all starting to look like charlatans? We'd rather stick to studying something more practical like quantum mechanics and relativity." However, with the end of World War II and the outbreak of the Cold War, the United States was suddenly awakened in 1962 by a collection of papers from the Russians called long-distance experiments. This collection was filled with various studies on extrasensory perception conducted by the Russians. It even mentioned a phenomenon that disregards time and space, a human superpower that allows one to directly see scenes from the past, present, and future using extrasensory perception, known as remote viewing. At that time, the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union had expanded from the oceans and land to the realm of space. Now, The Americans suddenly realized that the Russians had already been ahead of them for decades in the higher dimensional realm of the mind. This was alarming. They had to catch up. Coincidentally, at this critical moment, something happened at Stanford University. Targ and Hal, known as the Stanford twins, are authorities in the field of lasers. Targ excels in experiments, while Hal focuses on theory. However, both of them share a common hobby: quietly tinkering with the extrasensory research happening in Europe. For instance, Hal, due to his participation in a Navy project, had free access to a national-level magnetic field laboratory, which contained a shielded room, similar to the ultra-quiet rooms of today that can isolate external sound waves. This shielded room could not only block external sound waves but also isolate all external electromagnetic waves. Hal thought that vision relies on light waves, hearing on sound waves, and that touch, smell, and taste rely on electrical signals. Could it be that extrasensory perception beyond the five senses relies on electric fields, magnetic fields, and certain electromagnetic waves? So, on that day, Hal secretly brought an extrasensory perceiver into the laboratory, wanting to see if this perceiver could still have extrasensory awareness in the shielded room. To his surprise, when this perceiver heard about Hal's experimental plan, he laughed and said, "Do you believe I can make your magnetic pointer spin wildly like a tuning dial?" Hal thought to himself, "How is this possible? This shielded room is 9 meters deep underground, blocking all external electric and magnetic fields. Even if you were Magneto, I still don't believe you could make your magnetic force penetrate 9 meters of US military armor." However, when the experiment began, Hal was astonished. On the technical waveform, a stationary pointer actually began to move. My goodness, this had already surpassed my understanding of physics. The extrasensory perceiver that Hal brought was none other than the well-known remote viewing expert, Ingo Swann. But shortly after, the alarms in the laboratory began to buzz, and Hal was caught red-handed. There was no doubt that Stanford and the U.S. military had to bring this illegal intruder to justice. However, with Targ's efforts to rescue him, the CIA intervened in the case. They protected Targ, Hal, and Swann, and sent a psychologist named Green to oversee the research of Hal and Targ. Thus, a secret organization called the Stanford International Institute was officially established. They began recruiting extrasensory perceivers across the United States for the CIA and further studying the physical mysteries behind their abilities. Not long after, they hoped to bring in a friend, claiming he also had extrasensory perception. This friend was none other than the previously mentioned cryptic retired police officer, Pat Price. That day, Hal and Targ specifically designed an experiment for Swann, but unexpectedly, this experiment turned into a showcase experiment for Pat. The experimental code, "Scan it," means scanning coordinates. As the experiment began, Hal and Targ arranged a group of subjects to enter individual sealed rooms. Then, under the supervision of Dr. Green, a random coordinate was selected from a directory. After selecting the coordinate, it was distributed to each subject in the respective sealed rooms. Later, Dr. Green said, "Perfect, absolutely perfect." After inspecting the experiment himself, he greatly appreciated the meticulous work of Hal and Targ. This was a very scientific double-blind experiment, where the person providing the coordinates did not know what was at those coordinates, and of course, the subjects were unaware as well. In theory, They could only rely on their extrasensory remote viewing to perceive the coordinates and then describe the situation at those coordinates using language and drawings. Later, Targ showed us two drawings, one by Swan and the other by Pat, depicting the conditions at the coordinates. However, Dr. Green later expressed great disappointment upon seeing these two drawings, saying, "This doesn't make any sense at all. Whether by making phone calls or asking friends to check, the coordinates turned out to be a simple little wooden cabin." But what about your drawings? Is that a cabin? It seems that all this remote viewing and extrasensory perception stuff is nonsense, including Hal and Targ. When they compared reality with their drawings, they fell into contemplation. Why did it turn out this way? Furthermore, both Swan and Pat described seeing a facility resembling a military base. Swan mentioned radar equipment and personnel coming and going, while Pat also noted the presence of huge rolled-up doors large enough for jeeps to drive directly into. There are 4 levels underground, long corridors, password-locked doors, various file numbers, action directories, and so on. Targ does not believe that Swan and Pat conspired in advance on their descriptions. He decides to personally drive to the coordinates to see for himself. However, upon arriving at the coordinates, he is greatly disappointed. Indeed, there is a small wooden cabin there, but behind the cabin, he discovers a dirt road leading up the hill. Following the road further up the hill, before long, what comes into view is truly a huge rolled-up door, and American soldiers blocking his way. His heart tightened, unsure if it was joy or nervousness. Upon returning, he immediately reported to the military and further sought confirmation, inquiring whether there was such a military base as described, with 4 underground levels and an innermost research and development room named OTS. Whether there are many files inside, with file numbers like Q-ball, 8-ball, 14-ball, 4-ball, which are names of pool balls, and whether on the north wall of your underground facility, there is a slogan labeled, Operations Pool, as described in detail by Pat during his remote viewing. Continuing on, Green, Hal, and Targ all recalled that just over 30 hours later, the entire Stanford Research Institute was surrounded by the U.S. military, with a show of force that made it seem like none of them would be able to walk out alive at that moment. That coordinate? It turns out to be the highest-level secret base in the U.S. National Security Zone, the forefront of the U.S.-Soviet Cold War. You, on the other hand, directly mentioned the file numbers, even the operation code. Do you know what's in those files? Do you know about national security deployments? In short, are you a Soviet spy? It's better to kill 1,000 by mistake than to let one go. Not a single piece of paper can be left in your laboratory. Fortunately, CIA personnel intervened in time to vouch for Hal, Targ, Swan, and the rest, allowing them to narrowly escape. However, such a magical explanation, do you think the National Security Agency personnel can believe it? Targ suspects that it was after this incident that Pat began to be secretly monitored by the U.S. military. This kind of ability is too dangerous and may well have sown the seeds of his demise. Of course, as the funding agency, the CIA was both surprised and delighted upon receiving the remote viewing results. They decided to test Pat's abilities once again. In 1974, the CIA requested Pat to remote view a Soviet military base that even they were uncertain about. This location was not far from Moscow, very mysterious, and seemed to be involved in the production of some unconventional weapons. Targ recalled that on that day, Pat deliberately wore glasses. A CIA agent jokingly remarked that even remote viewing requires glasses. Pat humorously replied, "I'm presbyopic. This way I can see more clearly." In fact, Targ and his team conducted detailed research back then. The remote viewing results didn't appear visually in front of them but rather seemed like a thought directly implanted into the brain from top to bottom. Following that, in his remote viewing session, Pat mentioned, "I see a gigantic gantry crane, very large, and someone is coming out of it." He began sketching the appearance of this enormous gantry crane as he described it. Pat continued his exploration and mentioned that he saw a huge sphere underground, a steel ball that was not yet completed, with a diameter of at least 60 feet. Something like this. Not long after, U.S. high-altitude spy cameras captured the massive gantry crane. When compared to Pat's remote viewing drawing, it sent chills down people's spines. Moreover, based on the scale of the personnel and wheels in the spy photos, the gantry crane was truly terrifyingly large. However, where did Pat remote view that sphere? It wasn't until 3 years later. In 1977, U.S. military spies finally transmitted back a few photos, confirming that the sphere was indeed 58 feet in diameter, just a 2-foot difference from the data Pat remote viewed years before. It was later confirmed to be a protective casing for a Soviet secret particle beam weapon, intended to be used to shoot down American spy satellites. However, by this time, Pat had already passed away for 2 years. The story comes to this point where the elderly Targ presents many of their remote viewing drawings from that time. There were sketches of the compound and buildings that were nearly identical, drawings of an aerial view and cross-section of a circular building, accurately depicted connecting corridors, and many specific annotations of children's playground facilities, and so forth. Targ said that his biggest regret was agreeing to let Pat leave Stanford Research Institute after the gantry crane incident to officially join the CIA. Once there, Targ lost insight into much of the work Pat was involved in. Although the CIA has declassified over 70,000 pages of remote viewing documents due to the Freedom of Information Act, it is evident to keen observers that a significant portion of these files are heavily redacted, indicating that many details are still being concealed. From these declassified materials, some have coined the term, Stanford Three Musketeers. It was the duo of Hal and Targ who, during their time at Stanford Research Institute, nurtured 3 of the most powerful remote viewers. They are Ingo Swann, who remote viewed the moon, and Sergeant Joe McMoneagle, a psychic spy who executed hundreds of missions and was awarded the Legion of Merit by the U.S. military. Many believe that he was the strongest remote viewer in American history, but Targ believes that the strongest one was Pat. Unfortunately, his death remains shrouded in mystery. He traveled alone to Alaska on a business trip and died alone in his hotel room. The coroner attributed his death to a sudden heart attack, but insurance records revealed that shortly before the trip, he had purchased a large insurance policy with his wife as the beneficiary, almost as if he had a premonition of his own death. Targ does not speculate much on Pat's death. Perhaps he is still investigating. However, in the realm of urban legends, Pat's death is linked to Soviet spy assassinations, involved in the investigations of the Alaskan Triangle of Alternate Dimensions, connections to 4 crucial extraterrestrial bases on Earth, and psychic warfare between the United States and the Soviet Union, among many other theories. In conclusion, this is the story of extrasensory research that took place in the United States 50 years ago. Apart from Targ's revelations, there are corroborating accounts from doctors, Hal and Green, as well as the declassified CIA files spanning over 70,000 pages. Though bizarre, this is certainly a story that truly occurred. Alright, that's where today's story ends. Thank you, everyone.